So, you've decided to be a tank enthusiast. Either it was a movie that piqued your interest, or your autism tingling in the back of your head every time you see the suspension compressing against the terrain. And once you get that interest, you'll most likely fall into two groups, one of which divides into two subgroups. The first group is that you'll start watching World War II documentaries, most of which were made in the early 2000s, a time when those documentaries reigned supreme as the primary source for World War II tank knowledge. And the second group, well, you're just gonna have to wait and see. Now, almost every time these documentaries would invite so-called experts to talk about battles. However, whenever they started to talk about tanks, that's when the bullshit started to rear its ugly head. These experts/historians are used to reciting information that is easily accessible, like number of combatants, how the battle played out, etc. And the same can be said about tanks. What's more is that these documentaries tend to contradict each other depending on which front they're talking about. For example, on the Western Front, they'll say that the Panther is the best tank of World War II due to its superior armor, gun, and German engineering, and the Sherman was bad because it was designed to be mass-produced. But once they start talking about the Eastern Front, they flip a dime and proclaim that the T-34 is the best tank of the war, because they were able to be mass-produced, while the German tanks were bad, because they were over-engineered and expensive.
Jesus Christ, pick a lane.
It's because of this that most people who are starting to get an interest in tanks often paint an inaccurate picture of what a good tank design must entail. And here is where we get our two subgroups. One group will say that the Panther is the best tank of World War II because of its big dick energy, thick-ass armor, and rabble first MBT. And the other group will proclaim that the T-34 was the best tank of World War II and spam quantity over quality. However, if we roll it back a bit, I mentioned that there's a second group, one that can happen by sheer chance, that being... On December 15th, 2005, a new website called YouTube was launched, and 5 months later, it took the internet by storm. YouTube provided its users the ability to post relatively easy-to-make videos and allow people to share them with people they never met for completely free. Now, you might be wondering, why the fuck am I talking about YouTube? Well, as previously mentioned, when it came to World War II tank knowledge, most people used to use World War II documentaries as their primary source. Not to mention, these documentaries would air on television at a time when the internet was still considered something for nerds. However, with the launch of YouTube and other social media platforms, the internet was now seen as a new form of entertainment and became much more mainstream. And despite most tank-related content on YouTube still reciting the same bullshit these documentaries have been spewing for years, everything changed in 2014, once Fury came out. Fury was the first film that showed the Western Front from the perspective of a tank crew in the modern era of cinematography, and this sparked discussion, mostly about the infamous Tiger 131 scene. By all means, this scene is inaccurate, and only serves to enforce the "it took 5 Shermans to kill a tiger" myth, which for some reason became 10 Shermans in recent years for reasons I do not know. But because this scene was so inaccurate, this got people talking, and making videos about how inaccurate it is, which mostly consisted of two narratives. In both narratives, Fury is basically going to get knocked out, thanks to Fury being the leading tank, with most of them just adding the stupid advance from concealed cover and ending it at that. However, some videos tended to go the extra mile and point out that Fury has a 76mm gun, which once again sparked discussion about Sherman variants, leading to the M4A3E2, M4A376W HVSS, and most notably, the Firefly. Some of these variants are given more credit than is due, a good example being the Firefly, but that's beside the point. My point is that it pushed the Sherman from being viewed as a puny tank with paper-thin armor to a tank that served multiple purposes. And, thanks to videos like Inside the Hatch by Nicholas Moran, people started appreciating the Sherman for what it really is. A design that saw the bigger picture. And, leading back to this little chart I made, this is the second group. On one side, we got a group that follows a bunch of paid historians, and the other, led by curators of tank museums, actual tankers who've actually been inside a tank, and YouTubers who just so happen to be friends of said tankers/curators, resulting in information that actually has some thought put into it rather than more gun equal more DACA.
And now for something completely different.
For your entertainment, I've created this one-dimensional scale. I know that this will be an extreme oversimplification, but for the purposes of this video, it'll do. On the left we have the T-34, a tank that traded quality for quantity. On the right we would have the Panther, according to so-called historians, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to give this spot to the Tiger, as it's the closest thing to the definition of quality. First, let's talk about the prior, as that is the simplest to understand. Quantity sacrifices quality in order to achieve its goal, that being to make as many of the given thing as possible. The T-34 is a perfect example of this, as due to the significant emotional event that was Barbarossa, the Soviets needed a bunch of equipment fast, which includes the T-34, meaning the factories cut many corners in order to decrease production time. This meant that the T-34 was crudely made, with very little luxuries for the crew. For example, however, there is an upside. In a war of attrition, you are more likely to come out on top due to sheer numbers, given that you have the manpower, resources, and logistics to support those extra numbers, which, in terms of logistics, the Soviets didn't really have, often heavily relying on American Lend-Lease to keep them alive in the early stages of the war. So, being too reliant on quantity becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, you can spam your enemy to death until they rage quit, but on the other, if you don't have enough supplies or fuel to support your ever-increasing numbers, well, then you just made a poorly manufactured tank, which you can only effectively field in limited numbers. Looking at the other side of the scale, we got quality, which, as mentioned earlier, I've given to the Tiger. And just like quantity, quality has pros and cons. The pros of quality are obvious. The tank will break down as often, the crew are much more comfortable, increasing their effectiveness in combat, and they're spoiled with many more luxuries. But of course, there are cons. Quality sometimes means that in order to create the perfect tank, it needs to use rare metals that are extremely expensive, dragging up the price. Its production is much more time consuming, meaning that you can't make as many, and it means that if a piece of, let's say, the transmission is slightly off, there's a higher chance of the tank breaking down. All of these characteristics can be applied to the Tiger, including the reliability part. Now, stay with me here. The Tiger is actually more reliable than what people give it credit. In today's day and age, with the overcorrectness in tank culture, German tanks got a reputation for being extremely unreliable. However, with the Tiger, it's actually only half true. You see, the Tiger was designed to be the spearhead of an armored assault, meaning the crew would have ample time to properly maintain and prepare the tank for an assault, which, in all fairness, was an ungodly amount of time as the Tiger was extremely maintenance heavy. But when it came to the actual use of the Tiger, for reasons I do not understand, the Tiger was used in a quick response role. The Tiger was never meant to be shoved into this role. Imagine you have a group of Panther IVs defending a position, and 3 platoons worth of Soviet tanks start attacking said position. Those Panzer IVs would call for reinforcements. Let's say in this case, those reinforcements would be a platoon of Tigers. However, because those Tigers had to rush into combat, they weren't properly maintained, resulting in most, if not all of them breaking down before getting to the battlefield. If those Tigers would have been properly maintained, less or maybe even none would break down. However, due to so-called German engineering, designing the Tiger to be the perfect machine, that meant that the crews often didn't maintain their Tigers on a regular basis. Tiger is a perfect reflection of owning a German car in the United States. A BMW 540i might seem like a luxury car with all the nifty features, but when it comes to going to a routine maintenance check, the mechanics will often charge you more money, as German cars, especially Audis and BMWs, are a pain to maintain due to their complexity and need for specialized tools, leading to you, the owner, not going to these maintenance checks as often, leading to the likelihood of your BMW breaking down, making repairs much more costly. Had you owned something like a 2005 Ford Explorer XLT, then those maintenance checks would have been much more cheaper, leading to you actually going to those maintenance checks, resulting in the mechanics finding a problem before it even becomes an issue. So, now we have the left and the right, both sides representing what a good tank must entail according to most World War II documentaries. But Autistic nerd, you may or may not be asking, if the T-34 is on the left and the Tiger on the right, what goes in the middle? Well, my dear viewer, that would be the Sherman perfectly encapsulates the middle ground between quantity and quality. If we were talking about anything else, that being politics, cars, or planes, then the middle ground would tend to be the perfect spot, with the scale moving a little left or right depending on the user's needs. However, when it comes to tanks, for some reason, despite the Sherman being the middle ground, these World War II documentaries paint the picture that the M4 was a terrible tank, with the only advantage the Sherman having over German big hacks were mobility and numbers. Which means that the Sherman is more comparable to the T-34. But once again, these documentaries say that the T-34 was the best tank of World War II because of its numbers, often negating the fact that the survival chance of a T-34 crew when hit was much lower than what the Sherman crews had. Yet despite this, the Sherman gets a reputation for being a death trap, whilst the T-34 gets a pass. Now, I have multiple theories as to where this sort of thinking might have come from, which leads us to our next section.
We were just inadequate. That's all I can say. We just did not understand what we were doing.
My first theory is survivability bias. Due to the crews on average surviving a significant emotional event, this meant that they were more likely to survive and be invited onto documentaries to talk about their experience, and the experience they most vividly remember is when they were undergoing a significant emotional event. Kinda like how you can't sleep at night, so all you do is replay every single embarrassing moment in your head, causing you to not sleep even more. I'm going to give a small quote from the chieftain as he adds something to this. Ultimately, regardless of all the other factors, if tank A meets tank B, a lot of the virtues of A are utterly irrelevant to the question of survival of the next 3 minutes, like fuel efficiency and ease of maintenance, and in some cases even blaming its virtues. Damn it, if my tank hadn't been repaired so easily, I wouldn't even be here to get shot today. Resulting in some of those veterans, when invited onto talk shows, only mentioning that time they got knocked out, unintentionally leaving the historians in the room to think that the Sherman was inadequate and just another tank to throw at the enemy in large numbers. The leading spearhead in this was Belton Cooper and his infamous book, Death Traps. Belton Cooper, for those who don't know, was an Army Ordnance officer in charge of retrieving and overseeing repairs of knocked out American tanks. You can probably see the problem, right? Most, if not all the tanks he saw were damaged or knocked out, and with the Sherman being the most frequent frontline tank in the theater, it's no wonder he came to this conclusion, and in all fairness, I don't blame him. Here's the thing, whenever someone says, "Ah yes, the Sherman was a horrible tank," don't just say, "Nuh-uh, it was actually a really good tank." Instead ask, why? He'll then bring up multiple points, which you can then dissect and disprove along the way. You can also list the things the Sherman does really well, and why crew ergonomics is overall more important than big gun thick armor. If successful, you'll not only change his opinion, but also his way of thinking. A way of thinking that he'll then transfer onto other tanks like the Panther and so forth. Most of the time, these fellow tank enthusiasts either come from the first group that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, or just heard it from their friend, who heard it from their friend, who heard it from their dad, who heard it from his brother, who heard it from a documentary after September 11th. So instead of turning it into a brawl, turn it into a civil discussion/debate. Because who knows what Shadow Weird at AIDS has in his noggin? Maybe he's right. Maybe he's wrong. Perhaps both. My second theory is the image of the American hero winning against all odds, which was by all means a 9/11 thing. Now, I know I like sneaking 9/11 jokes into some of my videos, but this isn't a joke. After 9/11, a slew of World War II media started to get pumped out reminding people what we were fighting for. They basically wanted to show the US citizen that despite them being outmatched, the average US soldier was able to win thanks to its plucky heroics, causing a lot of Americans to sign up for the military, for cheap oil, peace, freedom, justice, and security. Back to those documentaries, they would also take some words from these veterans and take them out of context. For example, a veteran would praise the Sherman for how easy it was to repair, but because these documentaries had to keep a narrative, they'd sometimes cut them off and say, "But despite this, the Sherman stood no chance against the mighty German Panther," completely negating the Sherman's 3.6 KD ratio against Panthers, but either they intentionally left it out, or didn't bother checking in order to keep a narrative. My third and last theory is historians not understanding why the Sherman was so effective. Most often, these historians, when it comes to tanks, have something I like to call the video game syndrome. If you ask them back in 2006 what tank was the best of World War II, they probably say the Panther or T-34, and when you ask them why, they'll give you a simple answer. Ah yes, because the T-34 could be made in large numbers. Or, the Panther balanced speed, armor, and firepower, UUUUP first MBT. Like if those were the only factors what makes a tank good during a war. These historians often, as the chieftain would put it, miss the woods for trees, meaning they would often get caught up in the specifics like hard factors and completely negate the existence of soft factors, with the only outlier being production numbers. Meaning, the only positive thing these documentaries had to say about the Sherman was production numbers. They also think that tanks were only meant to fight other tanks, which resulted in the flawed view of a battle during the Second World War, especially on the Western Front. They also believe that the Sherman was only meant to fill the infantry support role, with the tank destroyer branch filling in the anti-tank role. But whilst this belief seems plausible on the surface, its entire foundation crumbles once you realize these two things. 1. The US tank destroyer branch served more as a quick response rearguard rather than a brawler on the front lines. And 2. The whole reason why the Sherman was designed in the first place was to counter Germany's tanks. That's why it has the 75mm, because that was the US's best anti-tank gun at the time. Now, let's talk about the Panther, because despite what these documentaries and video games might have taught you, this tank fucking sucks. Yes, this was a Sherman vs. Panther video all along. I bamboozled you. Compared to what the other major nations were producing at the time, the Panther was not a really good tank. Good compared to Japan or Italy, but compared to the US, UK, and to some extent the USSR, no. Despite most of its unreliability issues being fixed later on in later variants like the Aus A or G, there also came another problem: production quality. As the war dragged on, Germany pretty much said fuck it to the quality part and attempted to make as many Panthers as possible. This led to the quality of welds and steel being subpar, resulting in issues the early T-34s had. That being, if a round hit the armor at a high enough velocity and didn't penetrate, it would crack the armor and welds, leaving the crew exposed, resulting in the Panther being highly susceptible to the Sherman 75mm HE round. Not to mention, its transmission was extremely delicate, which meant that using neutral steering, which the Panther had, was extremely risky and heightened the risk of a transmission failure. The gunner didn't have a unisight, basically making him blind, and unlike the Sherman, the commander didn't have a way to traverse the turret, meaning the gunner was extremely reliant on the commander and vice versa. Its overlapping road wheels meant doing maintenance on it was worse than a 4-year vacation in a Siberian gulag. Its road wheels were not compatible with any other German tank, making logistics a nightmare. And another thing to mention is its sloped sides, mostly inspired by the T-34. Because those sides were sloped, including the turret, the fighting compartment was extremely cramped, meaning loading the 75mm was a goddamn nightmare. The loader's hatch, which is this large one on the back, was extremely heavy, making it opening and closing it extremely difficult, and the commander's hatch was very time consuming to open if fully closed. The only thing I can really applaud about this vehicle is its good blend of hard factors, relatively good cross-country performance, and a bore evacuator. However, these factors and gimmicks are extremely overshadowed by its inherent flaws. Now, a lot of people, especially ignorant War Thunder players, will say that the Panther II was the greatest thing to come out of World War II, but that's simply not true. War Thunder's rendition of the Panther II is stupid. The Panther's turret is already cramped as is, but the turret they gave the Panther II, the small term, is even more cramped. What's even worse is that they crammed an 88mm into a turret that already felt cramped with a 75mm. And just to put the cherry on top, it has a rangefinder, because crew comfort is overrated. War Thunder's Tiger II 105 has a similar story, but it's not as retarded as this one. Now, I know that a lot of people might have a problem with this video, as for a lot of people, the T-34 and Panther are their favorite tanks. And just like the Sherman vs. Tiger video I did back in March, I'll end it on a similar note. Just because a tank is bad or overrated doesn't mean it can't be your favorite tank. However, you also have to keep your own personal biases in check. Hey, I understand it. I also want my M4A376W HVSS to be able to knock out T-90M all the way back to the excuse of an aircraft carrier, that being Putin's receding hairline. But it can't. If there's anything I want you to take away from this video, is that you shouldn't trust everything you hear in a documentary, the Panther is arguably more overrated than the Tiger, and that video games aren't a good source for actual tank knowledge. See you all in December. Or January, depending on how jolly I'm feeling.